I'd so much like to welcome Dr. James McPherson, who's going to be presenting his lecture, When Will This Cruel War Be Over? The Failure of Peace Negotiations During the Civil War. Dr. McPherson was born in North Dakota, grew up in Minnesota, and he earned his BA degree from Gustavus Adolphus College in 1958. Earned his PhD from Johns Hopkins University in 1963, and from 1962 to 2004, he taught at Princeton University, where he is now the George Henry Davis 86 Professor of American History Emeritus. And I have it on good authority from someone who used to live in Princeton that she tried for years to get an audit spot in his lecture and could never, ever get in. Dr. McPherson's the author of 15 books and the editor of another 10, mostly on the era of the American Civil War and Reconstruction. His books have won several prizes, including the Pulitzer Prize in 1989 for Battle Cry Freedom, the Civil War era, and 2 Lincoln Prizes for, respectively, Cause and Comrades, Why Men Fought in the Civil War, and Tried by War, Abraham Lincoln as Commander-in-Chief. He's active in several organizations for historic and battlefield preservation, and in addition to several professional associations, he's also an elected member of the American Philosophical Society and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He's received honorary degrees from 10 American colleges and universities. Please join me in warmly welcoming Dr. James McPherson.
Well, thanks very much for that warm welcome. I appreciate it. I also appreciate the opportunity I had this afternoon to see the exhibit, Gone for a Soldier, which is a wonderful exhibit. I expect most of you have already seen it. It's worth seeing again if you haven't, seeing even if you have, and certainly worth seeing if you haven't seen it. The beginning of my lecture may sound a bit puzzling, but I hope you'll see pretty soon where I'm going with this introduction. In the 19th century, music was an essential part of American culture in which nearly everybody got involved, not merely as listeners, but also as participants. Hymn singing in church and at camp meeting revivals caught up a large part of the American population. People sang at work and play as well as in church. Many middle-class families owned a piano. Publication of sheet music was a big business in those days. And people were fond of gathering in the parlor of an evening to sing popular songs, sentimental ballads. Popular music both expressed and reflected important themes in American society and culture. And the Civil War brought even greater prosperity to music publishers. Soldiers in both North and South carried pocket songsters, as they were called, with words to many songs, both old and new, for singing around the campfire to tunes that everybody knew so well that they just had the words, not the music in these songsters. And as you'll discover if you've gone through the exhibit, many soldiers formed singing groups to pass away the time in camp and to uphold morale. Old songs were popular in both the North and the South during the war and expressed the universal longing of soldiers and of their families. Old songs like The Girl I Left Behind Me, Lorena, Ora Lee, and that all-time favorite, Home Sweet Home. Many of the new songs written specifically for the war were also shared across the lines, both Union and Confederacy. Such songs as All Quiet Along the Potomac, Just Before the Battle, Mother. Even Dixie, which had been written by a Northerner as a minstrel song before the war and was popular among Union soldiers in the early part of the war before it became a Southern favorite, and Abraham Lincoln once said that it was one of his favorite songs as well. In the first 2 years of the war, many of these popular songs were blood-stirring, enthusiastic, patriotic marches. the Bonnie Blue Flag and Dixie in the South, and as I mentioned, at first at least, Dixie also in the North. Battle Hymn of the Republic, or in its more popular and vernacular form, John Brown's Body. Battle Cry of Freedom, When Johnny Comes Marching Home, and others. These songs express confidence and a cheerful bearing of burdens and the risks of a war that was sure to end in victory for your own side. And many of these songs remained popular throughout the war. But by 1863, and especially 1864, the mood of some of the songs now being written and published began to darken, to become expressive of a growing weariness with war, a longing for peace, a desire for an end to the suffering and the killing. In contrast to the upbeat rhythm and words of most songs in the first half of the war, the music and words of many of these now were downbeat, almost funereal. By all odds, the most widely sung ballad in the last half of the war was When This Cruel War Is Over, sometimes also known by the first words of its refrain, weeping, sad and lonely. This song was written by a Yankee in 1863 and first published in the North, but like many sentimental songs, it became equally popular in the South with just a couple of changes in words, especially in the last year of the war. It sold 1 million copies in sheet music, an enormous total at the time, at a time, by the way, when the population of both the North and the South, the United States, was 1/10 of what it is today. So that would be the equivalent of a single today selling 10 million copies. By the summer of 1864, at least 500,000 men had so far died in the war. Almost every family, especially in the South, had lost a relative or friend. The words of the song, When This Cruel War Is Over, seem to express the pain of these losses. Oft in dreams I see thee lying on the battle plain, lonely, wounded, even dying, calling, but in vain. And this was far from the only song to express sentiments of this sort in the last year or two of the war. The titles of several other songs, originally written and sung in the North, but soon making their way across the lines, will make this point pretty graphically. And here were the titles of some of those songs. Who Will Care for Mother Now? Brother, will you come back? Tell me, is my father coming back? Mother, I have come home to die. Obviously, the stirring, heady optimism of 1861, the expectations on both sides of a short war and a glorious victory, had been replaced by a mood that sometimes bordered almost on despair and a desperate desire for this cruel war to be over. But how? How could the killing be brought to an end? How could peace be accomplished? There, as Abraham Lincoln might have said, there was the rub. Americans of the Civil War generation were far from the only people to discover that it is usually far more difficult to end a war than it is to start one. European nations relearned that lesson in the war of 1914 to 1918. Americans bitterly rediscovered it in the Vietnam War, and we've been forced to learn it all over again in the past 10 years or so in Iraq and now in Afghanistan. In a limited war where the goal is the defense or conquest of territory, a negotiated peace after that goal has been achieved by the victorious side is not always that difficult. And indeed, many American wars have ended with that kind of a peace treaty, negotiated peace treaty. The War of 1812, the Mexican-American War, the Spanish-American War. But in an all-out war, where the very survival of one or both nations or governments or societies is at stake, a negotiated peace sometimes seems impossible. And that was the case in the American Civil War, where the issues of national sovereignty and eventually slavery or freedom were, in effect, non-negotiable. By 1863, the year of the song "When This Cruel War Is Over," three different positions had emerged in both North and South about how to bring an end to this cruel war. The first was the official policy of both the Union and Confederate governments under Abraham Lincoln and Jefferson Davis. Peace could only be achieved by victory. For Lincoln, victory meant the surrender of Confederate armies, the dissolution of the Confederate government, and the return of the Southern states to the United States. And by 1863, it had also come to mean emancipation of the slaves. By 1864, the complete abolition of slavery. For Jefferson Davis, victory meant Confederate independence as a sovereign nation. This could be accomplished either by formal negotiations between a sovereign United States and a separately sovereign Confederate States, or merely by the North giving up, trying to conquer the South and withdrawing its armies from the Confederacy. As you can see, these official war aims on each side were mutually exclusive. No compromise was possible so long as each side defined victory in those ways. In effect, Lincoln's policy was unconditional surrender by the Confederacy. Davis's policy was unconditional recognition of Confederate independence by the United States. By 1863, these uncompromisable positions seemed to give little promise that this cruel war would ever be over. A second position held by several prominent people on each side was the advocacy of a ceasefire or armistice, followed by negotiations based on certain prior conditions agreed to by both sides. In the North, this position was associated with war Democrats like George B. McClellan, who, living in New Jersey at that time, ran for president against Lincoln in 1864, pledging negotiations to end the war if the Confederacy agreed to reunion as a prior condition for such negotiations. All other issues, McClellan said, were negotiable, including slavery. In the South, this position was associated most prominently with a pair of Georgians, Governor Joseph Brown and the Vice President of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens. They proposed that after military victories, the Confederacy should offer to come to the negotiating table during an armistice to work out a lasting peace. If the Lincoln administration accepted such an offer, this acceptance would constitute de facto recognition of the Confederacy as an equal power, and therefore an implicit, if not openly explicit, recognition of Confederate independence. If the negotiations should happen to break down and fail, Stephens and Brown believed that the North would never have the will to start the war up again. Now, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to see that this position held little promise for peace so long as Lincoln and Davis remained at the head of their respective governments. Lincoln had made it clear many times that he would not recognize an independent Confederacy implicitly or explicitly. Davis had made it equally clear that he would agree to no prior condition for negotiations, no prior condition of reunion. At one time or another, as we'll see, both Lincoln and Davis said they were willing to negotiate to end the war, but only if the other side would accept his prior conditions. But each president knew that his adversary would not accept such conditions, and therefore a negotiated peace was impossible. The third position on how to end the war was to advocate a ceasefire in negotiations without any prior conditions. Stop fighting, come to the negotiating table, work it all out there. That was the position of the Peace Democrats, or as they were often called, the Copperheads, in the North, and of their counterparts in the South, sometimes called Tories or Reconstructionists. In effect, these people came close to embracing the cause of peace at any price, even at the price of defeat. On both sides, this peace faction grew stronger when the war was going badly for their own side, and victory seemed impossible, or at least impossibly distant, and no longer worth the cost in lives and resources. They argued that if peace through victory was impossible, and as the war dragged on year after year, that seemed more and more to be the case, and if negotiations with prior conditions were unacceptable to the other side, then the only alternative left was to stop fighting and go to the negotiating table without any prior conditions. Now, in both North and South, these advocates of peace negotiations insisted that their national goals could be achieved by such negotiations. Peace Democrats in the North, like Clement Vallandigham of Ohio or James Wall here of New Jersey, said that negotiations would be the first step toward a brotherly reunion of North and South in one nation. It might take a long time, but you'd have to work it out step by step. And peacemen in the South, like William W. Holden of North Carolina, editor of the largest newspaper in that state, said that negotiations would be the first step toward recognition of Southern rights and sovereignty, although Holden never defined carefully what he meant by those words. But of course, both sides could not be right. And any request by one side for an armistice when things were going badly for their side would in effect be a confession of defeat, an offer to stop fighting in the hope of salvaging a little bit of dignity and to prevent further destruction and defeat. That was the case with Germany when it requested an armistice in 1918. It was a confession that Germany had lost the war. In the American Civil War, most people on both sides recognized that for one side to request an armistice in negotiations without prior conditions would be likewise an acknowledgement of defeat. So the Peace Democrats in the North and the peacemen in the South were branded by the majority in each section as traitors to their cause. Okay, to summarize so far, there was a kind of catch-22 about the whole notion of a negotiated peace in the Civil War. An armistice with prior conditions was impossible because the other side would not agree to such conditions. An armistice without prior conditions amounted to a surrender because the side requesting it was in effect admitting defeat. Now, so far, this discussion has been a little bit abstract. So let's take a look at the fate of various peace initiatives from 1863 to 1865 to put some flesh on these arguments. The first of these actually involved New Jersey, along with other northern states, where Democrats, and especially the peace wing of the party, the so-called Copperheads, made big gains in the state and congressional elections of 1862 at a time when the war seemed to be going badly for the North. Here in New Jersey, the Democrats gained control of both the governorship and the legislature in those elections. Northern morale and the consequent increase in the strength of the Copperheads dropped even lower over the winter of 1862-1863 with military defeats at Fredericksburg and Chickasaw Bluffs in December, followed in the spring of 1863 by the dispiriting defeat at Chancellorsville. Confederate leaders grew hopeful that these developments would make possible an overture for peace negotiations that would result in Confederate independence. There was a man in the Confederate War Department named John B. Jones. who kept a very detailed diary that's a valuable source for historians. Jones, while he was a native of North Carolina, had lived here in New Jersey for many years before the Civil War, where he edited a newspaper in Burlington. When the war started, he went back south and got a job in the War Department at Richmond and kept this diary. And in this diary, he paid a lot of attention to political developments in the North, and especially in the state where he had lived so long, New Jersey. His diary in January and February, especially of 1863, commented on developments in the New Jersey legislature and in public meetings around the state that called for a ceasefire and negotiations. Petitions that flooded into the New Jersey legislature denouncing the Emancipation Proclamation, which had just been issued on January 1st, 1863. The legislature in January 1863 elected the notorious Copperhead James Wall to the unexpired term in the United States Senate. In a speech that received widespread publicity in both North and South, Wall said, "I am a peace man and have been from the first, because I never could understand how war with all its horrors and atrocities could restore the Union." And to a lot of people in the North, that looked like a good sense in the winter of '63. In March 1863, Wall said, "There would be no peace except on the basis of separation." Even on July 4th that year, the day that Vicksburg surrendered to Grant and that the Army of Northern Virginia began its retreat after the bloodletting at Gettysburg, Wall continued to insist, "When you talk to me about a war for the Union, you state a contradiction in terms." Another event took place on that July 4th, 1863, less well known than Vicksburg or Gettysburg, but equally important to an understanding of why this war could not be brought to an end by negotiated peace. After the Confederate victory at Chancellorsville in May 1863, and the decision by General Robert E. Lee and President Jefferson Davis for Lee's army to invade the North, Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens undertook a mission that he hoped would lead to peace and Confederate independence. As Lee was confronting the Union Army in Pennsylvania, Stephens traveled under flag of truce to Union lines at Fortress Monroe, Virginia. His ostensible purpose was to seek a pass to Washington to meet with Abraham Lincoln, who he had known in Congress when they both served back in the 1840s, to meet with Lincoln to try to straighten out problems that had arisen in the prisoner of war exchange cartel. But Stephens was also carrying secret instructions from Jefferson Davis to open peace negotiations with Lincoln. The assumption underlying these instructions was that after Lee won another victory over the Army of the Potomac in Pennsylvania, which Lee and the South were confident they could do, the Lincoln administration would be forced to acquiesce in the demand for peace. But the request from Fortress Monroe for permission for Stephens to come to Washington reached Lincoln on the 4th of July, at the same time as the news from Gettysburg also reached Washington. So word went back to Fortress Monroe to deny Stephens the pass he sought, and that was the end of that. Northern morale revived, Copperhead influence plunged, James Wall pretty much disappeared from view, and the Lincoln administration's policy of unconditional victory again began to command a large majority support of the Northern people. In the spring of 1864, after several Union military victories in the second half of 1863, not just Gettysburg and Vicksburg, in the spring of 1864, Ulysses S. Grant became Union General-in-Chief and made his headquarters with the Army of the Potomac, while he put General William T. Sherman in charge of the second major Union Army in Georgia. When Grant and Sherman launched their offensives in May 1864, Many in the North hoped that these heavy hitters could win this cruel war, would win it by the 4th of July. But instead, by that date, Union armies were bogged down in apparent stalemate after suffering 90,000 casualties in the most concentrated carnage of the war so far. And a good many of those casualties were suffered by New Jersey troops, especially the 1st Jersey Brigade at the Wilderness in Spotsylvania. On July 12th, 1864, an editorial in the New York newspaper asked plaintively, "Who shall revive the withered hopes that bloomed at the opening of Grant's campaign?" Confederate military strategy in 1864 was to fight on the defensive from elaborate entrenchments and force the enemy to waste his manpower attacking these fortified defenses. If the Confederates could hold out until the Union presidential election in 1864, and if they could inflict enough casualties on the attacking Yankees, they hoped to defeat Lincoln's re-election and then negotiate with Lincoln's Democratic successor for a peace that would recognize Confederate independence. By July 1864, that strategy seemed to be working. Editorials in Democratic newspapers were headlined, "Stop the War." If nothing else would impress upon the people the absolute necessity of stopping this war, its utter failure to accomplish any results would be sufficient, one of these editorials stated. By August 1864, the veteran New York Republican politico, Thurlow Weed, who was one of the sort of gray eminences behind the scenes in the Lincoln administration, Thurlow Weed was convinced, as he put it, the people are wild for peace. Lincoln's re-election is an impossibility. In this climate of opinion, in the summer of 1864, two separate and abortive peace efforts took place, both of them illustrating the impossibility of a negotiated peace so long as Lincoln and Davis stuck by their war aims. The first effort was inaugurated by Horace Greeley, the quixotic editor of the New York Tribune, one of the North's most powerful Republican newspapers. In July '64, Greeley wrote a letter to President Lincoln. "Our bleeding, bankrupt, almost dying country longs for peace," he wrote, "shudders at the prospect of fresh conscriptions, of further wholesale devastations, and of new rivers of human blood." Greeley had learned that two Confederate envoys were at Niagara Falls, Canada, supposedly bearing peace proposals from Jefferson Davis. "I entreat you," Greeley went on in this letter to Lincoln, "I entreat you to submit overtures for pacification to the Southern insurgents." Lincoln responded immediately, authorizing Greeley to bring to Washington under a pass of safe conduct, quote, "any person anywhere professing to have any proposition of Jefferson Davis in writing for peace, embracing the restoration of the Union and abandonment of slavery." Lincoln knew perfectly well that these Confederate agents were in Canada to stir up trouble and encourage anti-war activities in the North, and not to negotiate peace. But he could not ignore any opportunity, at least to appear to be open to the possibility of trying to bring this cruel war to an end. And Lincoln also thought he saw an opportunity in this episode to show to the Northern people the hollowness of Southern professions of a desire for negotiations. He prodded Greeley to go to Niagara Falls to meet these supposed peace negotiators face to face. Greeley did so, accompanied by one of Lincoln's private secretaries, John Hay, bearing Lincoln's terms for negotiations, reunion, and emancipation. However, Lincoln's strategy on this occasion boomeranged on him. The two Confederate agents, named Clement Clay and James Holcomb, turned this affair into a Confederate propaganda victory by releasing a statement to the press accusing Lincoln of sabotaging the chances for peace by prescribing conditions he knew to be unacceptable to the Confederacy. This press release proclaimed in wonderful 19th century rhetoric, "If there be any citizen of all the Confederate States who has clung to the hope that peace is possible, Lincoln's draconian terms will strip from their eyes the last film of such delusion. And if there are any patriots or Christians in the North who shrink appalled from the illimitable vistas of private misery and public calamity presented by Lincoln's policy, let them recall the abused authority and vindicate the outraged civilization of their country." In other words, vote Lincoln out of office. Lincoln turned out to be the loser in this propaganda blitz, and this news was spread all over the newspapers. The Northern Democratic press blasted the president as the sole obstacle to peace. Even some Republican newspapers criticized Lincoln for appearing to be inflexible. Greeley scolded him for giving, as Greeley put it, for giving to the general eye the impression that the rebels are anxious to negotiate and that we repulse their advances. "If nothing was done to correct this impression," Greeley went on, "we shall be beaten out of sight next November in the election." But then Jefferson Davis did something to neutralize this Southern propaganda victory by his response to a virtually simultaneous, although less publicized, peace overture. This one was initiated by a more obscure Northern journalist than Greeley, a man named James Gilmore, and by an Illinois Army colonel with a good war record who hoped to bring an end to this seemingly endless slaughter. They persuaded Lincoln to give them a pass through Union lines in Virginia for an unofficial effort to see Jefferson Davis, and they actually persuaded Davis to receive them. Lincoln again hoped that this unofficial contact would smoke out Davis's insistence on Confederate independence as a prior condition to any negotiations. And this time it worked, sort of. In a meeting between these two Northern envoys and Davis and his Secretary of State, Judah Benjamin, in Richmond, Davis expressed defiance toward Lincoln's supposed willingness to negotiate on the basis of union and freedom. "We are fighting for independence," Davis declared defiantly, according to Gilmore's account of the discussion. "We are fighting for independence, and that or extermination we will have. You may, quote, emancipate every Negro in the Confederacy, but we will be free. We will govern ourselves if we have to see every Southern plantation sacked and every Southern city in flames." Well, after all of the publicity about these two abortive peace overtures, no one could doubt that Davis's irreducible condition of peace was disunion, while Lincoln's was reunion. This served Lincoln's purpose of discrediting Copperhead notions of peace and reunion through negotiations. As Lincoln later put it in a message to Congress, "Davis does not attempt to deceive us. He affords us no excuse to deceive ourselves. He cannot voluntarily re-accept the Union. We cannot voluntarily yield it. Between him and us, the issue is distinct, simple, and inflexible. It is an issue which can only be tried by war and decided by victory." But at the rock-bottom point of Northern morale in August 1864, when, as Thurlow Weed put it, the people are wild for peace, Northern Democratic newspapers were able to slide around the awkward problem of Davis's conditions by pointing to Lincoln's second condition, emancipation, as the real and only stumbling block to peace. As a typical Democratic editorial put it, "Tens of thousands of white men must yet bite the dust to allay the Negro mania of the president." Even some Republicans criticized what they described as Lincoln's blunder in making emancipation one of his conditions because it enabled the opposition to fasten on that condition, on that issue, and ignore Davis's insistence on disunion. Henry J. Raymond who wore two hats, one as the editor of the New York Times and the other as the chairman of the Republican National Committee in Lincoln's re-election campaign. Raymond told Lincoln on August 22nd that if the presidential election were to be held then, the Republicans would lose big. Raymond said, "Two special causes are assigned for this great reaction in public sentiment. First, the want of military success, and second, the impression that we can have peace with Union if we would, but that you are fighting not for Union, but for the abolition of slavery." Lincoln came under enormous pressure to drop emancipation as a prior condition. To do so, the argument went, would highlight Davis's insistence on disunion so clearly that nobody could miss it. The Republican National Committee urged Lincoln, quote, to make distinct proffers of peace to Davis on the sole condition of union, all other questions to be settled in the convention of the people of all the states. Of course, they went on, they expected Davis to reject any such proffer, which would, quoting them again, which would dispel all the delusions about peace that prevail in the North and reconcile public sentiment to the war, the draft, and the tax as inevitable necessities. Lincoln almost succumbed to this pressure. He drafted a letter to a Northern Democrat that included this sentence: "If Jefferson Davis wishes to know what I would do if he were to offer peace and reunion, saying nothing about slavery, let him try me." And Lincoln also drafted instructions to Henry Raymond to go as an official envoy to Richmond and propose, as Lincoln's official representative, quote, that upon the restoration of the Union and the national authority, the war shall cease at once. All remaining questions to be left for adjustment by peaceful modes. But having gone this far, Lincoln drew back. He did not send that "let Jefferson Davis try me" letter. And he canceled Raymond's mission to Richmond. Why? He was convinced that to back off publicly, with all of the publicity that any such action would get, to back off publicly from emancipation as a condition, even as a ploy to smoke out Davis, would be seen as a betrayal of the freed slaves who had worked and were even then fighting for the Union. Lincoln told weak-kneed Republicans, "No human power can subdue this rebellion without using the emancipation lever as I have done." He pointed out that 100,000 black soldiers and sailors were at that very moment fighting for the Union. "If they stake their lives for us," Lincoln said, "they must be prompted by the strongest motive, the promise of freedom, and the promise being made must be kept. Why should they give their lives for us with full notice of our purpose to betray them? I should be damned in time and in eternity for so doing. The world shall know that I will keep my faith to friends and enemies, come what will." When Lincoln said this, he and everyone else fully expected him to lose his bid for re-election. Just a few days after Lincoln spoke these words, the Democratic National Convention nominated General McClellan for president on a platform written by Clement Vallandigham that declared in its key plank, "After 4 years of failure to restore the Union by the experiment of war, we demand that immediate efforts be made for a cessation of hostilities with a view to an ultimate convention of the states or other peaceable means, to the end that, at the earliest practicable moment, peace may be restored on the basis of the federal union." That last phrase was mere window dressing. Virtually everybody realized that the earliest practical moment would probably never come, and that without a prior agreement on reunion, any such cessation of hostilities would be tantamount to Confederate victory and independence. That's why McClellan in his letter accepting the nomination, in effect repudiated that section in the Democratic platform and made union a prior condition for any ceasefire. But this whole question suddenly became moot. 2 days after McClellan's nomination, a telegram arrived in Washington from General Sherman, 6 words long. Atlanta is ours, and fairly won. After a summer of evident failure and frustration, the Union military effort suddenly seemed now to have picked up momentum. The capture of Atlanta on September 1864 turned morale around in both North and South by 180 degrees. A New York diarist, George Templeton Strong, kept one of the best diaries in the North, wrote on September 3rd, "Glorious news, Atlanta taken at last, 3 exclamation points. It is, coming at this political crisis, the greatest event of the war." On the other side, the Richmond Examiner reflected glumly that the disaster at Atlanta came in the very nick of time to save the party of Lincoln from irretrievable ruin. It will diffuse gloom over the South. And indeed it did. And things only got worse for the Confederacy in the next few months. Victories by Union General Philip Sheridan's Army of the Shenandoah all but destroyed Jubal Early's corps, once commanded by Stonewall Jackson. Lincoln was triumphantly reelected on a platform calling for unconditional surrender of the Confederacy and a 13th Amendment to the Constitution to abolish slavery everywhere and forever. Sherman set out on his destructive march through Georgia. At the Battle of Nashville in December, Union General George Thomas's army virtually wiped out the Army of Tennessee, the Confederacy's second largest army. In January 1865, a Union task force captured Fort Fisher in North Carolina, closing off the port of Wilmington, which had been the last port into which blockade runners could bring supplies. The Confederacy's days now seemed numbered. In this context of events, one more effort for a negotiated peace flared up and then fizzled out. This time it was the old Jacksonian Democrat, who had been subsequently one of the founders of the Republican Party, Francis Preston Blair of Maryland, as quixotic in his own way as Horace Greeley. It was Blair who set up a meeting between Lincoln and his Secretary of State, William H. Seward, on the one side, and 3 Confederates, led by Vice President Alexander Stephens, on the other. They met in early February 1865 on the Union steamer River Queen, a sort of presidential yacht for Lincoln, at Hampton Roads, where the James River empties into Chesapeake Bay. The meeting was cordial. As I mentioned earlier, Lincoln and Stephens had been friends back in the 1840s when they had both served together as Whigs in Congress. Stephens was, in some ways, a fascinating figure. He may have had more brains and certainly less brawn than anyone in the South. He weighed only 95 pounds and was so pasty-faced that an irreverent Confederate soldier who saw him once said that he had been dead for days but didn't know it yet. Stephens was in the habit of wearing a thick, heavy, floor-length fur coat, even in mild weather. When he wriggled his way out of this coat for the meeting with Lincoln and Seward, Lincoln remarked that he had never seen such a small ear of corn come out of such a large husk. Stephens took this ribbing in style. Everybody relaxed. But if the Confederate commissioners thought that Lincoln's hospitality and the relaxed atmosphere meant easy peace terms, they were in for a rude surprise. No real negotiations would be possible, Lincoln said, until all Confederate soldiers laid down their arms. When the Southerners responded that during the English Civil War of the 1640s, even King Charles I had negotiated with rebels in arms, Lincoln responded wryly, I do not profess to be posted in history. All I distinctly recollect about the case of Charles I is that he lost his head. In any case, said Lincoln, his terms were the same as they had been the previous summer: reunion and emancipation. The Southerners professed shock, but clearly such professions were disingenuous. Lincoln had never given them any reason to expect otherwise. After all, at the low point of Northern morale the previous summer, he had insisted on these very terms. There was certainly no reason to make them any softer now, with Union forces victorious everywhere. Jefferson Davis, however, was delighted with the failure of the Hampton Roads Conference. It was just what he expected and what he wanted. He went before a mass meeting in Richmond to rally his people to fight on to avoid such a degrading submission and a humiliating surrender, his words, as Lincoln's terms demanded. If they were to avoid such humiliation, they must continue to fight. In a fiery speech, Davis predicted that Confederate armies would, as he put it, would yet compel the Yankees in less than 12 months to petition us for peace on our terms. It's not clear whether Davis really believed in this fantasy. In any event, Southerners should have paid more attention to Lincoln's words in his annual message to Congress back in December 1864, after his reelection. The Northern people, he said, were never more determined to win the war than now. And the resources to do the job, he said, are unexhausted and, as we believe, inexhaustible. Material resources are now more complete and abundant than ever. We are gaining strength and may, if need be, maintain the contest indefinitely. These must have been chilling words to any Confederate who read them. Even more chilling, perhaps, were Lincoln's words in his second inaugural address on March 4th, 1865. Not the famous closing paragraph, "with malice toward none, with charity for all, let us bind up the nation's wounds," and so on, but the paragraph that came just before that, in which he said, "Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray, that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Yet if God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled by the bondman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword, as was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether." Fortunately, the war did not go on indefinitely. 5 weeks after Lincoln's second inaugural came Appomattox. The war did not end with a negotiated peace. Given the non-negotiable war aims of each side, it could not have done so. It did end with the surrender of Confederate armies and the extinction of both slavery and of the Confederate States of America. Well, thanks for your attention. I'll be glad to try to answer some of your questions for a few minutes. Two questions. What is my take on why the South did not pursue a strictly defensive strategy sooner than it did when it was finally forced to in 1864? And second, what are my plans, or what's going to happen for the 150th at Gettysburg? Well, let me just briefly comment on the second one first. I'm a member of the board of the Gettysburg Foundation, which is a partner with the National Park Service in running the visitor center at Gettysburg and managing many aspects of the battlefield. And they have big plans for the 150th next July. Although I don't know exactly what part I'll take in those plans, I'm sure I'll have some kind of plan. There'll be programs, there'll be special tours of the battlefield, there'll be all kinds of things going on. The question of the defensive strategy in the Confederacy. The Confederacy never settled on a consistent strategy during the course of the war. Initially, Jefferson Davis's basic strategic idea was to try to defend the entire Confederacy from incursions by land or water. This is sometimes called a cordon defense or peripheral defense. What that meant was small Confederate armies stationed all around the perimeter of the Confederacy. At Pensacola in Florida, at Savannah, at Charleston, several different places in Virginia, in Tennessee, in New Orleans, and so on and so forth. By early 1862, using their sea power and river power primarily, the Union forces were penetrating many of these places and penetrating deep into the heartland of the Confederacy on the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers and eventually the Mississippi River. That caused Confederate strategy to evolve into what is sometimes called a strategy of concentration and then the offensive defensive. The Battle of Shiloh is a good example of that. After losing most of Tennessee, the Confederates concentrated a pretty substantial army under Albert Sidney Johnston at Corinth, Mississippi, and then took the initiative to attack Grant at Pittsburgh Landing in an offensive attack with the hope of recapturing Tennessee. The Battle of Shiloh frustrated or defeated that. And the chief exemplar, I think, of the offensive defensive was Robert E. Lee when he took command of the Army of Northern Virginia in June 1862. First in his offensive against McClellan, then he moves into Northern Virginia and beats John Pope. He moves into Maryland and is stopped at the Battle of Antietam. But again, he repeats that whole offensive defensive at Chancellorsville and then, of course, the invasion of Gettysburg. And I think the idea here was, and it's an idea associated most prominently with Robert E. Lee, the idea that the Confederacy, with its inferior population and resources in numbers and economic resources, could not withstand a long war, a war of attrition. That eventually the preponderance of power in the North would wear down the South. And that the South's only chance of victory was to strike through these offensives when it had the strength to do so, in the hopes of inflicting enough defeats on the Army of the Potomac especially, but on other Union armies as well, to convince the Northern people they could never win this war, to undermine the morale not only of the enemy armies but of the Northern people, and force them to negotiate a peace. Well, that didn't work. But it was the dominant Confederate strategy in 1862 and 1863. Almost by necessity, in 1864, the Confederates were forced by their loss of so much territory and resources and men to fight only on the defensive. And that almost worked, as I just pointed out, until, because of the stalemate in both Virginia and Georgia in the summer of 1864, until Sherman broke that stalemate. But I think, I don't know if that's really answering your question, I think that the main reason for the non-inclination to pursue a strategy of defense from the very beginning was also rooted in the temperament of the Southern people. They regarded themselves as a martial people, as better fighters than these shopkeepers of the North. Kind of echoes Napoleon's attitude about England half a century earlier. and that they could carry the war into the enemy's country and force the enemy to cry uncle by beating up on him. So I think that has a lot to do with it too. They really did not adopt the kind of what you might call Fabian strategy of a defense, try to wear out the will of the other side, as they did in 1864, until they were forced to do so, because I think otherwise it was contrary to the kind of temperament and ideology of the Southern people. Yeah. Question concerns the efforts by Britain to mediate an end to the conflict. There were such efforts, and they reached a climax in 1862. Of course, cotton played a big role in this. As a consequence of the war and the Union blockade, the export of cotton from the South to Britain and to other European countries was almost entirely cut off in 1861 and 1862. Some began to get through on blockade runners, but for the most part there was a radical reduction, and it was really hurting the British economy. Britain also saw itself as being the kind of balance of power world policeman in the international relations of the 19th century, and saw themselves as playing a role in trying to maintain the international order of stability and peace. And so the British government under Prime Minister Viscount Palmerston was seriously, and the French together under Emperor Napoleon III, seriously contemplated an offer of their good offices to mediate an end to the conflict on the basis of separation in the summer and fall of 1862. They looked at Lee's victories in the 7 days and at Second Bull Run, Lee's invasion of Maryland, Braxton Bragg's invasion of Kentucky. The Confederates seemed to be on a roll. This seemed to be a good time to make such an offer because the Lincoln administration was on the ropes with these Confederate offensives. This is when the Confederate offensive-defensive strategy seemed to be working. But Palmerston was a canny and cautious politician, and he wanted to await the outcome of Lee's invasion of Maryland. As he put it in a letter to Lord John Russell, who was his foreign secretary, in September of 1862, if the Federals sustain a great defeat, they will probably be open to the offer of mediation, and we should strike when the iron is hot. But if the Confederates suffer a defeat, maybe we should pull off and wait a while and see what develops. And when the news of the Battle of Antietam and Lee's retreat to Virginia reached Britain in early October 1862, Palmerston backed off. The French still wanted to go ahead, but the British cabinet in a really important meeting in early November 1862 voted, I forget the exact vote, I think it was something like 8-4, not to go forward with this offer of mediation.
It's also been very hard to after Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation.
Well, then that's the next thing. Of course, Antietam was also important in that respect because it was Antietam that gave Lincoln the victory he had been waiting for to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. And once he followed through on January 1st with the final proclamation, that made it virtually impossible for the British to intervene on the side of the Confederacy. Up until that time, it hadn't been a war of freedom against slavery. But now it was clearly a war of freedom against slavery, and the British people were an anti-slavery people, and Britain was very proud of its role as the world's policeman against the slave trade, and had been the nation that had carried out the largest emancipation so far back in the 1830s in its colonies in the West Indies. So the double whammy of Antietam and the Emancipation Proclamation brought an end to any possibility of European intervention along those lines. The French still at times wanted to go forward, but they were not going to do it without Britain, because Britain is the greatest navy in the world. Yeah. The question concerns efforts over the winter of 1860-1861 to ward off this crisis that was building toward war. There were many efforts in Congress and a so-called peace convention with delegates from most of the states that met in Washington in February of 1861 to try to come up with some kind of compromise to stem the tide of secession, which by February 1st, 1861, 7 states had gone out, and avert what was looking like it was going to build up into a crisis that might turn into a war. All of those efforts failed because the most, I don't want to call them extreme, but we'll call them the left, which in those days was the Republican Party, by the way, and the right, which were the Southern Democrats, which commanded a majority in in each section, saw any kind of compromise as a complete threat to the integrity of their ideology, their position, their survival as a party and as a region. And so all the compromises, which would have involved concessions basically by the North on this issue of slavery extension, which Lincoln was not willing to do. And the 7 states that had gone out said, you know, no matter what you offer, we're gone. So they all broke down. And of course the trigger, the spark, was Fort Sumter that started the war, and neither side was willing to give in on that one either.